There's tension at the top of British government. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson was told off by the Prime Minister's office over comments about Saudi Arabia, with a statement saying his views did not represent official government policy. Johnson claimed the Saudis were puppeteering and playing proxy wars in the Middle East, causing the Prime Minister to distance herself from him, explaining the Foreign Secretary was speaking in a personal capacity. This has caused confused scenes in Parliament, where Boris Johnson has been accused of hypocrisy by Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry. She challenged him to explain why he ordered MPs to vote against Labour's calls in October to suspend support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen until a lasting ceasefire has been brokered and until alleged violations of international humanitarian law have been properly investigated. At the same time, others, such as Liberal Democrats' Shadow Foreign Secretary Tom Brake, praised him for speaking out and talking sense. All the while, Saudi Arabia has been widely reported to be committing war crimes in its military campaign in Yemen. The British public is therefore being treated to a contradictory diet of support for Saudi Arabia from the Prime Minister and criticism of it from the Foreign Secretary, creating divisions in Parliament. The confusion in the media means it is very difficult for the ordinary citizen to make sense of what government policy actually is towards Saudi Arabia. What is the British Foreign Secretary's responsibility? And should the Prime Minister have supported Boris Johnson's comments about Saudi Arabia? These are some of the simple questions we sought to answer. Boris Johnson said Saudi Arabia is causing sectarianism and instability in the Middle East. What are the public's thoughts on this? We asked them.
I think there are some merits to those, but he needs to be a little bit careful about making such statements, given that he is representing UK, and it's not just his personal view, it will be viewed as the UK policy, which is clearly not.
I think maybe this is the rare occasion where Boris is right.
Well, I don't know enough about it. He said that he's also then taken it back, so...
I think he probably is, yes. He's quite an opinionated bloke, he's quite jovial and plays the fool and is quite funny, but on an international stage he's an embarrassment. So, I don't think he's doing more harm than he's doing good at the moment, I would say.
Well, I think he was great as a mayor of London, but he's definitely causing everybody to question things about his foreign policy. So I think Saudi Arabia is a cause of concern because of their human rights, but I suppose I'll leave that for politics to answer.
I think he's probably speaking what everybody else probably is thinking. They're not the only ones, but there's a mix of the Saudis and the Iranians who are having a proxy war in the Yemen and in the Middle East generally, so he's right.
I think it's very clear that Saudi Arabia is an extremely sectarian state by its very nature, very clearly. So, for example, the open practicing of another religion in Saudi Arabia, particularly I have in mind Christianity, is simply illegal. And there are many people who are arrested for having Christian religious gatherings. And that's to say nothing about having churches. There can be no churches in Saudi Arabia, for example. And a few years ago, the Grand Mufti of Mecca was quoted as saying that every Christian church in what he called the region should be closed. Now that's obviously true for Saudi Arabia, so he therefore means either the wider Arabia or the whole of the Middle East. And you can't get more sectarian than that in your very nature. And also it has a particular brand of one branch of Islam. So it's sectarian to an extreme degree. And I think that's widely understood.
Yes, Saudi Arabia is spreading sectarianism. But this is, there's a lot of countries that are spreading sectarianism outside of the Muslim world, within the Muslim world, if that makes sense. So there's the Europeans and the North Americans are to blame as well, but they're not getting mentioned in this conflict. The thing is that these conflict, the lazy media makes out that it's all to do with Sunni Shia. This is why they're fighting. Saudi Arabia is not bombing the Houthis because they're Shia. They're bombing them because they're anti-imperialist. The sectarian side is more a byproduct of the war and something that's spread by Saudi to promote the war in that way. So, and I don't see it as a proxy war, as Boris Johnson said, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is another thing that the media is trying to imply. It's a proxy war between the Western imperialists and Iran. And Saudi Arabia is a proxy of the West.
Should the British Foreign Secretary merely represent the interests of the British Prime Minister, or is his job also to represent the concerns that the British public might have about countries like Saudi Arabia? We put that to the public.
I think when the Foreign Secretary represents the views of the British people, I think he's doing a very good job. I understand the need for diplomacy and what am I saying? I understand the need for diplomacy. I understand the need to maintain relationships, and sometimes that means saying things privately rather than saying things publicly. But I think when you do speak out and speak publicly, I think that's a good thing. And when you do that based on what you believe, I know a lot of people agree with what he said, so I think that's reasonable.
Well, the Prime Minister also representing people, so it's one of the two things. They are not two separate things. So, and if there is some division, they need to first of all agree on what's the formal UK policy on that, isn't it? So there's not two separate policy. There shouldn't be, and there isn't, as far as I believe.
Britain has been a representative of human rights for centuries, and I think it's time now for them to speak up against Saudi Arabian regime. And like I said, for once, Boris is right. We need to speak up against what's happening in Saudi Arabia.
Well, he should do the concerns of the people, but usually the MPs represent the people.
Well, it should be one and the same. Like, the Prime Minister was elected by the people, so it should be the same thing. But I suppose if it had to pick one, he is kind of appointed by the Prime Minister, so he should be representing the Prime Minister.
Well, ultimately, the Prime Minister is his boss, so he's got to tread a fine line between what he says and what he believes as an individual, which could well be representing the views of people like me, or he might well be voicing what the politicians themselves feel, but somebody's got to be prepared to say it. And it might be easier for Boris to say it because he's Boris than it might be Theresa May to say it because she's in a rather different position.
Clearly, people would expect a government minister to take notice of what people say and think. The idea is that you go to your MP and your MP represents you to the government. That's the theory. But it's very well understood that it doesn't work like that in Britain, that there is nothing more than foreign policy which is kept well out of the hands of the mass of the people. So clearly he should represent it, but clearly within the governmental system it's well understood that, especially with foreign policy, that these matters are to be decided behind the scenes, behind closed doors, and the people are to be kept away from such issues. That's the way the government actually works, and it's wrong, but it's the way it works.
The British Foreign Secretary is supposed to represent Britain. So therefore, that means people of Britain within a democracy. If the interests of the people of Britain are opposed to that of Theresa May, that's a problem with the democracy. That's something that's wrong here, you know. But he has to also live up to his words. He has to practice what he preaches. He can't go Saudi Arabia a few days later and start distancing himself from these comments and not bringing it up. Like I said, there's a lot in the media at the moment saying, talking about the internal policies of Saudi Arabia, criticising it, but not enough on the external policies. You know, Britain shouldn't be getting involved in the internal policies, but when we're helping a country to destroy another country, that's a whole different issue, especially since the Yemeni Prime Minister has basically said Britain is committing war crimes in Yemen.
Boris Johnson's comments were not well taken by the British Prime Minister, with many people suggesting he won't be in the job much longer. If Johnson were replaced for telling uncomfortable truths about the Saudis, what does the public think that would say about British democracy?
Well, I'm not sure that he was telling the truth about Saudis as such. I think he fell short of telling the truth also about the British involvement with the Saudis. In a sense, it's double standards. Because if he's going to criticize the Saudis, then he has at the same time to say how they got those arms. And that came about afterwards. We kind of learned that the arms that are being used by the Saudis would have come from the West somehow. So that was left out of his commentary, perhaps.
Challenge the question because you're assuming that he's telling the truth, which is, I think, probably an opinion rather than a fact. But should he be fired? I don't think he will be, I think is the answer. I don't think that will happen. I think for various political reasons, she has to keep him regardless. I think he's survived.
Boris should be fired for many other reasons, but not in this case for speaking up against the Saudis. I think this will send a wrong message. We are here not just for business with the rest of the world, but also to uphold democratic human rights values, which need to be supported. It's not just about business.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? He's telling the truth but Saudi Arabia is our biggest weapon sellers. So I think the Prime Minister is obviously wanting to keep relations intact, especially in the Middle East, because of the current influx of immigration. So I think she's just trying to keep peace at the moment because Brexit is the main issue on her agenda.
I don't think it says a great deal, but I think there are other issues behind the scenes, and I think the likelihood of him being fired, it might be cumulative, but it won't be for what he said about the Saudis.
On the first part, I think you have to grasp that we are living in very strange times, and the appointment of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary was itself a very unexpected thing, and British politics is in a very strange state, especially, of course, because of Brexit, but other things as well. So the fact that Theresa May appoints Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary surprised very many people. Boris Johnson has a reputation for speaking out. Generally, it's on a very bad basis. For example, he once attacked the entire population of Liverpool and put them down, and I don't think he goes to Liverpool anymore, for example. So to appoint such a man who has nothing of the arts of diplomacy about him as Foreign Secretary was very strange. So it's not clear that this situation where Boris Johnson has said something that is clearly against British policy, it's not clear that that was unexpected. So I wonder about that. I'm not sure that his days are numbered. It may be as simple as saying that Theresa May simply wants him out of the way, wants him to rack up a number of these mistakes, and then she can get rid of him. Maybe, but maybe not. It's very difficult to calculate what game is really being played on both sides. As far as the question of democracy goes, I think that considering that the British government's policy is to declare that it will intervene anywhere in the world where it thinks democratic standards are being violated, and there is no country in the world that has less of the democratic values that Britain claims to uphold, then on that level alone, it tells you about British democracy. The good aspects of British democracy are at home, and they are not for export. And Britain raises the question of democracy simply as an excuse to intervene, and that's all.
Well, obviously this would be an awful shame towards democracy in Britain, but it's not something that's new. George Galloway was kicked out of Labour for speaking the truth on Iraq, and as Shah was suspended by Labour for basically making the point that if America's so adamant to build a country on someone else's land, they should do it on their own land. It makes sense. David Ward was suspended by the Liberal Democrats for saying people shouldn't be using the Holocaust to create another tragedy. So I think anyone who goes against Saudi Arabia or Israel, Britain's two biggest allies, and again speaks out against their human rights, is under threat. And even MPs, it shows who's actually in power in this country. If the government here can't speak out, someone must be above the government for them to be having to be feared on this level, which is a shame on democracy again.
The UK's relationship with Saudi Arabia is worth an estimated £5.6 billion in weapons alone, including fighters and military hardware. It is claimed thousands of British jobs depend on these links, at a time when the UK is experiencing a growth rate of 0.5% and risks going into recession. These issues seem to make it hard for the government to admit Saudi links with terrorism and its poor record of human rights. Does the public think Theresa May should have backed her Foreign Secretary for simply saying what many political analysts believe to be true, namely that Saudi Arabia's actions have further destabilised the Middle East?
Well, of course, as I said, if he's saying something, he needs to be a little bit careful. As I said earlier as well, he needs to understand what's the UK foreign policy and what's UK official stand against, on those countries and on those points. And he should have been a little bit careful about making such a statement.
I can understand her position as the Prime Minister. She cannot openly, explicitly agree. Maybe Boris could have worded the message better. Maybe there could have been a little more diplomacy and subtlety in the message. So I can understand her hesitance in supporting such a direct, such a harsh message. However, now that he has said it, he cannot be fired for stating the truth. So I think there's a bit of a balancing act that needs to be done. However, firing him is not the answer.
Yeah, I think she should have been behind him and supported him. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I suppose she's got a game to play on an international stage, and regardless of what she thinks or what Boris Johnson says, I suppose she has to toe the international line. So, it's hard to say whether she should back him or not. But she obviously has to pander to a wider stage than Boris Johnson does.
I don't think it's the right moment for her to back him, because at the moment she has so many issues internally. If she puts herself back into Boris Johnson, then automatically she's going to have so much more to do and cause an international stir. So I think it's the best thing for her just to keep out and say she doesn't back him. But legally, we know Saudi Arabia, it's a bad country for human rights.
There's a difference between saying something that's true and saying something how it should be said. There are a lot of countries which do a lot of awful things. You cannot just say it however you want. You have to be politically aware and quite grown up about these things.
It's almost a truism. It's almost something that goes without saying to point out that there is tremendous hypocrisy in the stand of the British government in relation to the question of democracy and in relation to the question of Saudi Arabia. And that's well understood. And it would surprise nobody who knows anything about the Middle East that Saudi Arabia should be criticised, but it would equally surprise them that it's the British Foreign Secretary who does it, contrary to British government policy. And clearly it's wrong. Clearly, by almost 99% of opinion would say that Boris Johnson was correct. What he said is that they wage proxy wars and they puppeteer. And everybody would agree with that, but you mustn't say it. And that's the central hypocrisy that everybody understands.
I believe that Theresa May should be saying it herself, never mind having to back her Foreign Secretary, if she cared about humanitarian issues. We see with Keith Faz as well, the Labour MP, he's basically criticised Boris for this, saying how that it threatens their close relationship with Saudi Arabia and it ruins the UK's image. This shows from a humanitarian angle he doesn't care about the Arabs or the Middle East.
Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest purchasers of UK weapons. Could it be that this is why Johnson's comments have been met with such hostility from the British Prime Minister?
Oh, could be, yeah. All boils down to money.
I think as soon as you get economics and stuff like that involved in it. It's got to be a cause. It's when we're selling so much to them, to upset them is going to affect that relationship. So I think the reason is we want to maintain the relationship and we want to maintain a sort of diplomatic relationship, and that is probably because there's a lot of weapons going on. So yeah, I think that's probably true.
We can't speak against the Chinese. We welcome them. We roll out the red carpet when the Chinese Prime Minister comes to UK. We are not allowed to speak anything with the Saudis. It's all about business.
I wouldn't be surprised, yeah. Where arms deals are concerned, obviously there's billions to be made, and she's obviously trying to protect her interests there, so that's probably why she's gone against what Boris has said.
No, I think he's referring to the Yemen war. As you notice, the media is not covering much, it's covering most in Syria, but we know that within Yemen war, thousands of people are dying because of Saudi Arabia. In turn, Boris Johnson is correct, but I think politically, Theresa May is obviously, and the BBC is being blinded by the whole politics, because no one is publishing about Yemen, and a lot of things are happening.
Well, I think we've got the balance between. I don't think it is, no. I don't accept the fact it's created hostility with the British Prime Minister. I think that's probably been something which is kicked up by the media. I think the reality is that the government know that the arms industry is important to us. If we don't sell them arms, then somebody else will. What we've got to endeavour to do is to temper the manner in which they use those arms.
Clearly, the question of British exports to weapons exports to Saudi Arabia, clearly they are central to the British government's position and to Theresa May's criticism of Boris Johnson. Anybody who looked at the situation and didn't think that that was so, you would wonder what planet they were on, because Britain has had a series of major arms deals with Saudi Arabia, previously for the Tornado fighter bomber and currently for the Typhoon fighter bomber. And there are, for example, I believe 5,000 employees just of British Aerospace, just of that company, permanently based in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia couldn't fly these aircraft without the British assistance. And the arms trade is clearly part of foreign policy. Of course, it has a commercial aspect, but it has a political aspect and so on. And you sell weapons or you don't sell weapons precisely to engineer a situation to support one side and oppose another and so on. So you can't disentangle these things. And yes, the Saudi arms weapons question is absolutely central to British government policy and motivation.
I think this is one of the reasons. Obviously, Britain is selling cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia, which are being used in Yemen. And even though Saudi Arabia is not party to the Cluster Munition Coalition Treaty, the UK is. And this bans them from being involved in these sort of conflicts or selling these sort of weapons. But at the same time, there's other reasons as well. Obviously, the Houthis are Britain's enemy in this way because they're an anti-imperialist group. So they would want to get rid of the Houthis as well. That any attempt that they want peace, this is what Keith Faz was saying as well, that we need better relations with Saudi to be able to make a peace deal. They don't want a peace deal. They're also selling weapons to Saudi. Jaish al-Fatah have said in Syria in an interview that they're getting weapons from Britain and America through Saudi Arabia. So these weapons are going into Syria as well. This is what their main path into Syria. So there's quite a few different reasons why they're sending weapons through Saudi Arabia, and they'd want to continue doing so.
Boris Johnson's ministerial allies condemned Downing Street's attack on Johnson, calling it a ridiculous attempt to belittle a member of the cabinet. One government minister, Gavin Barwell, said it was Mr Johnson's job to set out British concerns and that it is right to raise these issues. Boris Johnson has accused Saudi Arabia of using others to fight its battles in the Middle East and of twisting Islam. The fact the British Prime Minister seems unhappy with her own Foreign Secretary, whom she herself appointed, suggests those who oppose Saudi Arabia's military activity are being silenced by others who crave the benefit of powerful and wealthy allies in the Middle East, regardless of the moral cost to Britain.